like one criticism of REBT is that it dehumanizes people because it assumes that we want to eliminate like kind of negative emotions. So, we're experiencing anxiety, depression, or unhealthy anger. Like, we need to get rid of that. And this is the one. This is kind of like my bugbear one, actually, because I actually find REBT is the opposite. I find it very humanistic because it doesn't seek to eliminate negative emotions. In fact, it's very clear that it distinguishes between unhealthy negative emotions and healthy negative emotions. So we shouldn't kind of necessarily have this like meta, like it's kind of like meta anger, if you like, about, I feel angry and I shouldn't ever feel this negative emotion, and that makes me feel angry. It's like, well, it's humans to feel angry about something, but REBT seeks to, in my opinion, and I'd love to know your opinion on this, Martin, is seeks to do two things. And the first is to modify it. So if you're feeling that it's unhealthy anger, so anger that doesn't suit your purpose, then it seeks to modify it to a healthy anger rather than eliminate anger itself. And I guess the second thing that it tries to do is have the individual like accept, like shit happens and you are going to feel angry sometimes. And not only is that normal, but it can be adaptive. It can be a good thing, but you just need to, utilize it in the right way. What are your thoughts?
There's two words there that you said that I want to pick up on, because I think those two words in themselves bring about a lot of misconception in REBT. The first word is modify.
Okay.
So modify cognition, modify emotion. That's a bit of a misnomer.
Okay.
Because, of course, we can't go back in time and change things. And the extent to which you can modify an emotion whilst it's happening, okay, that's not a very good solution. If you look at the emotion regulation literature, the kind of response modulation, trying to change the response as it's occurring, that's not ideal. You want to be regulating emotion before that point, before it gets to the emotional reaction. So modifies in REBT, sometimes we call it cognitive change. Again, that's not right, because you can't change the cognition. You're having the cognition. What REBT does is help you to negate that cognition. So you're not necessarily modifying it because it's happened. It's in its own time and space, isn't it? So if you say, I want to succeed and therefore I have to, which would be a good example of demandingness, a preference turned into a demand. Now, the preferential belief would be that I want to succeed, but I don't. But that doesn't mean to say I have to. So you're extending the belief, not necessarily modifying the belief that's already taken place.
Okay.
And it's the same with emotion. You're not modifying the emotion. You're trying to set yourself up in a way that you approach the world as it is, with a set of rational principles, so that when you face adversity, you can respond and emote with functional emotions. Not to say you will change a dysfunctional emotion to a functional one. Does that make sense? So modify is one of those things that gets wrapped into, it's not really that accurate. The second thing you said there is accept. And this is such an important part of REBT. And obviously, again, same as lots of words that are used in particular therapies, they have their separate definitions. We've already spoken about stoicism and rationality. And acceptance is another one of those things. So some people, when you talk to them about acceptance, they might assume that acceptance means passively, just tolerating whatever happens to them. But obviously in REBT, acceptance is more about active acknowledgement. You said it there. Yes, that's reality. Okay, that's happened. Right. So what are my choices? What are my options? What can I change? What can I control? And that's very different to just accepting, for example, just accepting failure passively. What we help people to do in REBT, if it's to do with failure, is you accept it as reality. You acknowledge it, that it's okay. This has happened. It's reality. It's there. What do we do about it? How do we stop it happening next time? We don't say, oh, well, failure is just one of those things. If it happens again, it happens again. It's fine. No, it's not about passive acceptance. And it, so there's two things there that even in your question sort of flagged up. Words that we would use because we know what they mean from an REBT perspective, but outside of REBT, they mean completely different things. So when we say cognitive change, we don't literally mean change the cognition or modification. We don't literally mean modify that thing, because that thing has already happened. You can't modify it. It's more about, in the future, can you learn to express more functional emotion and more rational beliefs, not change the ones that have already happened,
It makes perfect sense. And it's interesting how that does happen. We kind of use this language. I think language was particularly important to Ellis as well. I know he wrestled with the term low frustration tolerance. He felt it was quite glib in some places to kind of label something as that, but frankly, he couldn't settle on a better one. So he used that. But it just goes to show how important it is to kind of label these things accurately. That term of acceptance is particularly relevant, I think, to populations that we might work in, so in performance fields, in sports fields, because some people might see acceptance as not caring. So, I accept, we hear, I can't accept failure, and we assume, well, that's a really good thing because that's motivating, it's driven, etc., etc. And yet, people do lose, and you do have to accept that there are going to be there's going to be adversity, such as failure in performance fields. And the other kind of interesting part, and I guess I'll leave my question a moment to me there, is that we spoke about this kind of like negating the sort of cognition in the future, so we don't feel that way. We know that sports people, particularly the population I work with in sports officials, they tend to become very like problem focused rather than emotionally focused when issues occur. So they tend to blame any kind of negative emotion, and I mean unhealthy negative emotion, on an event, and then think, like, how can I stop that event happening ever again? And I guess there's some element of like adaptivity or productivity to that, but actually it's probably going to happen again sooner or later. Like, again, like, shit happens. So just, do you think that with that in mind, REBT is particularly useful for working with sports people, or is it useful for everyone? And maybe that's like a criticism of REBT, is that it might only be applicable in certain fields. What do you think?
Well, you think that the acceptance piece is particularly interesting because obviously it does have connotations, as you said there, of that passive acceptance. But you are, particularly within sport, within life generally, you are occupying an adverse environment. Like, as you said there, shit happens. Shit will happen. There's nothing you can do to change that. You could spend your entire life changing external stimulus, which means you're never stressed. And when I say stressed, I mean not the feeling of stress. I mean stressed as in be put under stress and strain, whether that's psychologically, physically. That's what life is really. And I take sort of a Schopenhauer stance on this around suffering. That's part of life, and it's part of the definition of life. Now, how do you want to approach your environment as an athlete, as a coach? Do you want to approach it as it is, or do you want to approach it as it should be? Now, I think the former is a lot more powerful because it means you often accept what you can't change and you start with you. So what can I change within myself and my practice, my thoughts, my behaviors that might get me closer to that goal? And then after I've exhausted that, are there things outside of me that I can tweak and change, that are within my gift to tweak and change, which might, again, get me closer to that goal? But to start with the environment, with the motivation and the goal to change my emotions or to make me feel better, I don't think that's a good route. And I think it's a potentially exhausting route, and it's a route to failure. If your motivation to change the environment is to change my emotion, to make me feel better, to make me feel less anxious, angry, to make me more happy, then I don't think that's a good motivation. Now, if your motivation is you see some injustice, there's genuine pragmatic things that you can tweak and change that actually better the lives of people, better your athletes, then I think that's different. That motivation isn't just emotion regulation. But from what I see in the environments that I work within, often the motivation to change external things is to change my internal feelings. I'm angry, so you have to change. Well, maybe some of your anger is to do with you. what you're telling yourself about the encounter that you've just experienced. Why would you assume that someone else has to change because of your anger? Now, if something that, say somebody does something to you that is genuinely wrong, is objectively wrong, then that's a tricky. I know that's a tricky balance, but okay, and you want justice, and there's a moral aspect to that somebody's behaved poorly, and that's different. That's different. Your motivation is to make things more just, to make things fairer, and that's different. But if it's to make me feel better, then I don't think that's sufficient or good motivation to change the external environment.
And that is
I
going to bring me on.
I think you start with you start with you. You start with yourself.
Yeah.
And then you exhaust that, don't you? Until
well, it's interesting. I was going to say this is sort of classic individual psychology, and maybe one of the reasons why if we sort of go back to the beginning, which is about why REBT has maybe been overlooked. I was reading one book around individual psychology, and it stated that it's hard. Like, individual psychology is difficult because it's hard to look internally, and the authors of this particular book sort of cited that however long your life has been, it will take another 50% of that to kind of change those beliefs and change those kind of that viewpoint. Now, I'm not quite sure how scientific that equation is, but of course, I think the point would be that it's just difficult, and it's easier to focus externally and maybe blame others. I guess one of the things you were speaking about there, about how well, I think that's different, and I think this is this is the kind of another of these classic criticisms of REBT. I've seen it written in papers. I've had conversations with people about this, and that's who are you to say what's rational and what's irrational? Now, I think I know what you're going to say to this, but I think you're going to be much better at articulating this for the listeners. So why is that a misconception of REBT, that you're the expert telling someone how to think?
There's a few things, really. I mean, partly it doesn't really reflect the work that you're doing in REBT. What you're doing in REBT is helping the individual you're working with to decide for themselves whether what they think and believe is getting them closer or further away from their goal. That's where the rationality is. Now, if somebody has particular beliefs that aren't helping them, then you flesh those out with that person, and then you make a choice to challenge them and maybe try to instantiate some new beliefs that are rational, that do get them closer to their goals. All that we're noticing in REBT is there is a pattern of thinking which tends to detract from goal pursuit. And those things just so happen to be unscientific viewpoints, beliefs formed with not beliefs that aren't true, beliefs that can't be true. It's a really important distinction in REBT. It's not that irrational beliefs aren't true, it's that they can't be true. It just so happens that the patterns that we notice and the patterns that Ellis noticed of the kinds of things that people believe that don't lend themselves to goal achievement are those things that aren't very scientific. The second thing is we have enough data on this now to know that people who strongly hold irrational beliefs experience more negative emotion, for sure, and a range of other deleterious, problematic outcomes. So the data is in. These things seem to be causing some problems. And then thirdly, when we apply REBT and help people to change that, we see good outcomes for those people. They tend to be able to pursue their goals much better and can lift themselves out of suffering. But I think underneath all that, I always think about just helping the individual. So it's not that we're going to go in and say, oh, what you think is irrational, because you've said some words that in REBT we say are irrational. So you have to change. You got to change that now, because in terms of my definition, you're being irrational. It's just a mischaracterization of what we do, and people who write papers, such as myself, are partly responsible for that mischaracterization, because you have to write to a word limit, and you're very quickly trying to tell people what you did and what happened. The nuance of it is that you and the client together make a decision on the extent to which what this individual believes and thinks is irrational or rational. Then you make a commitment together to make some changes if you determine that those thoughts and beliefs aren't helping the individual to get to their goals. So it's not that say, who are you to say something's irrational? Well, that's not what we're doing anyway.
Yeah.
We have these set irrational beliefs in RBT have been codified in a certain way because of patterns that have been noticed, and we have psychometric analyses. You've done some psychometric work. You understand how that works. Well, these particular patterns of thinking seem to relate to problematic outcomes. So it's like, well, okay, you can call it what you want, really. We don't have to call it irrational or rational, or call it what you want. It's just that there's this pattern of thinking that seems to be problematic for people. So that's what we try to go for.
I guess, like, what do you do as a practitioner where you're noticing this pattern of thinking, this classification of thinking, and someone's just, but I think it helps me. You have an athlete that believes that the demands they have, for instance, are helpful for them. What do you do? Do you then, do you have this kind of like moral or professional obligation to try to correct them, or advise them or guide them better, or do you leave them to it?
No, I think you want to help them to understand that what they think is outside of the boundaries of evidence and logic. Okay, but if it's helping them, then who you to change it? Well, all you can really do is have an informed conversation with them about those beliefs and how you have to take the rough with the smooth.
Yeah.
Okay, this is what these sets of ideas and beliefs are giving you, but in the future you have to know that this is what it could potentially take from you. So I think there is a moral obligation to outline the risks of certain ways of thinking. But if somebody says genuinely, on match day, this really helps me to get where I need to be and perform, then I don't know from what perspective you're going to try to help that person to change that. So you're always trying to, again, it's that scientific, that nuanced. Okay, here's the pros and the cons. So I'm. So as a practitioner, say you're the client and you say to me, I just really, really believe that failure is intolerable. I cannot tolerate failure. And I say to you, okay, but you have to also know that you have failed in the past and you're still living and breathing. So you have tolerated failure in the future, which kind of undercuts your belief that it's intolerable. And they say, yes, but believing this for me helps me to get that edge and helps me to perform. Okay, fine. Perfect. Let's figure out how to make sure that this belief is constrained to your performance environment and it's not something you direct at life or at people you coach or at children you might have. Don't pass on that intolerance to people around you. If it helps you, fine. How do we constrain it to the performance environment? So I think it's my job to outline the pros and the cons with the athlete. It's not my job to make them change it because it sits in the irrational box in one of the REBT books. These are patterns of thinking that seem to be related to poor outcomes. It's not 100%. If you look at the data, it's not like a perfect correlation between this way of thinking and problematic outcomes.
Yeah,
there's always variability with every human being, and that's part of the humanistic side of REBT.
Yeah, it's like a contributing factor. Yeah.
Exactly. Along with lots of other things that might predict that outcome. But your beliefs are part of it. Yeah.
Well, I think what we've done is in 40 minutes, Martin, we've now presented to the listener exactly why REBT shouldn't be overlooked, although we have discussed why it has been in the past, but also kind of shot down those misconceptions and misunderstandings around REBT. And of course, now everyone is going to be a very keen researcher and reader around REBT literature. Would you agree?
Well, yeah, I think that we could maybe have this conversation again because there's more misconceptions, aren't there, than what we've outlined here, and each one needs the attention it deserves. So I think there are more. So maybe we could have a separate conversation about more of those things because I think it's interesting and it's important.
Yeah, I think maybe a following episode, that's something that we pick up actually, because there's so many more misunderstandings around REBT that I think do need to be ironed out. And like you said, we're constrained when we write with word counts and publication size, etc. We can't necessarily go through it every time, which is why this format's particularly useful for addressing these limitations.
Well, these misunderstandings come from different places. Sometimes they're genuine misunderstandings based on connotations of different words used within REBT. Sometimes these misunderstandings are more political, and it suits people to misconstrue REBT as something it isn't, because they, for whatever reason, don't want to see REBT become prominent in any way. And it also goes against some mainstream political ideas, which maybe we can get into too. So yes, there are genuine misconceptions in any approach, because it's complicated, and language can be quite specific within a particular area. And there's also not so genuine misconceptions and misconstruals of REBT that serve people to try to push REBT under the rug.
Yeah, there's definitely maybe as way of leading into another recording, Martin. There's a great quote from like a Greek playwright, I think it was Euripides, who stated that it doesn't matter how many how proficient like a boxer or a wrestler or an athlete is, it's irrelevant, because their worth to society is less than mine. And when I sort of like first kind of read this, lots of things came to mind. But now with like an REBT hat on, I'm thinking, is this person like holding this belief that someone's worth is based purely on what they contribute to society, and therefore you must contribute to society or you are worthless? And so I think there's this, and this is like thousands of years ago. So I guess my point would be, do we have like these kind of like this human need to sort of downplay other perspectives or other people's beliefs in favor of our own, by way of conflict, or the drive for strength to raise our position in the hierarchy for whatever reason? And that's maybe one reason why REBT is kind of like downplayed by other people, because they want to argue the case for their perspective.
Maybe that's another half an hour conversation.
It's quite a deep one, that.
We'll get into it. I think there are definitely more legs in this area, and I think it helps us to explore REBT a bit further as well by going through the misconceptions, because it helps us to outline REBT specific ideas as we go, doesn't it, as well? Great.
Cheers,
thanks for listening, everybody, and hopefully see you at the next one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.